we are at a critical moment in history. The predictions of the civilizational level consequences of ideas have all come true. We all sense it. We all feel it. So what is God calling us to do? Does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean for you and me, not just these famous people, to emerge as truth tellers in whatever spheres of influence that God has placed us? That's what Truth Rising really is all about. And it's really a call to Christians to embrace this as part of what God wants them to be and wants them to do in this moment.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews, David Mahan joining you once again. And David, I didn't know that I was a soothsayer, but last week I went on my rant about all the betting that was happening with the Cleveland Guardians. Before that episode even aired, Governor DeWine came out and said that he was also against prop bets in Ohio. So, just me speaking that into the atmosphere made it happen.
Thank you, Mike.
If you need help on the policy side, just let me know. I'm always available.
And Mike, we trust. Is that what you said?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So, I'm just saying that as a cautionary tale. We might want to be careful where we venture today so we don't bring anything else into reality.
Speak anything into the atmosphere.
Well, one thing that had been long talked about that finally happened this past week was President Trump. I don't know that it happened this past week specifically, right, but the fruits of it came about this past week. President Trump defunds the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's the parent company of NPR and PBS. Corporation of Public Broadcasting is going away.
Finally killed Big Bird.
Is that like your dream? You've been like hunting him like a turkey or something?
It's like reincarnated Big Bird needs to die. But it's something that I'm very, very thankful for. When I'm coming in like a long drive from home in traffic or whatever, I listen to the Republican pundits and I listen to NPR. Right? They are not journalists. They have a spin. And I want to hear what the Democrat left spin is, just like I want to hear what the Republican, right? And so nobody who's about spin should be getting federal dollars, right? That's really what the discussion is here.
Yeah, and the arguments that I've heard for NPR are basically, well, we need this so that the public is an informed public kind of thing, but completely being oblivious to the fact of how partisan the reporting has become.
Yeah, far too biased and ideological to be receiving tax dollars, right? And so if you want to do what you do, that's fine, right? But you don't get $1 billion to basically be the microphone for the extreme left.
Right. And I saw an argument on X, so venture there carefully as always, but it was essentially someone who was in favor of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting saying, all right, show me one example of this bias that you're claiming. And comment section was hot. Like, it was good stuff of just, all right, well, here's where you had disinformation about Russiagate and just one thing after another, listing 5 really solid examples or more.
I joke about killing Big Bird, but, when you've got Sesame Street, supporting and promoting Pride Month every year, when you've got Muppets being born sons and asking if they could be daughters, saying they want to be daughters. I mean, this is just stuff that we don't need to be funding, right? Again, if you want your kids to watch that kind of material, there's all kind of things out there online that you can, on the left or the right, send your kids to watch. But we're talking about, should this be tax funded?
Yeah, and when Jim Henson was running Sesame Street, different story. I think there is a legitimate emphasis on what are some of those basic fundamental educational pieces you need preschoolers to think through. And now it's just, as you said, David, totally ideologically driven.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we're seeing it in local media as well. Interesting story on NBC4's website this week about a program called Out in Ohio, which apparently you've watched. For your own words, you said that as you walked in.
Okay, today. All right, I logged on and saw Out in Ohio.
Binge watched all the past episodes.
To the degree that one can binge watch 1 minute before the podcast. No, I mean, but who knew, right, that NBC4 had an entire show called Out in Ohio, right? Again, we're talking about woke media. We're talking about, biased and ideological media. Tell me about what's going on in, Gaza. Tell me about what's going on in Israel. Tell me about what's going on in Russia, China and Taiwan. Why do we need entire, right? Are we going to do black in Ohio? Are we going to do Jews in Ohio? Right? We're going to do Amish Mike in Ohio? Everybody going to have their own in Ohio?
I mean, none of the Amish would watch it because they don't have electricity. And much love to my Amish ancestors up in that part of the state, but
But I just, again, it to me, these are both media-oriented stories that are saying that we've gotten way out of control in terms of messaging, right? It is important that we have strong and accurate and fair journalism in America, and we have gone far from that. And if you look at the ratings for NBC4, they've been dropping. And again, if you look at the ratings for the Democrat Party, right, who these folks speak for, I saw on CNN not too long ago that they're seeing record low support for the Democrat Party. I think CNN had them, 26% down in favorability ratings, and then even Wall Street Journal had them, down 30 points in just historic low support because they've gone so woke, right? So it's not even about left or right. It's just that you guys have gone so far off the reservation. It's time to come back to center. And these are just two examples.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because obviously in my role, I deal with the media a lot. Sometimes I drag you kicking and screaming into dealing with them as well. And I know you really appreciate when I do that.
That's why I love Mike Andrews.
But
all my heart.
The point there is that we've actually seen this firsthand of you could do a very thorough interview with one of these local media stations, give them 5 minutes of great content, and they're going to take, 12 words that are maybe painting the most fringe position possible. Right. And it's in no way representative of anything that you said or the argument that we're making.
They took 20 minutes to find 2 seconds to paint me into somebody else's narrative.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what they do. And most people really don't see it like that. Right. There are no more Walter Cronkites, who just can't laying out what's going on in the world. Most of the media that I've experienced are over the last 20 years, that's what they do.
Yeah. And when we try and push back against them on the narrative, pushing back against the narrative, that's what we're here for. Hopefully that's beneficial to our listeners and they get that other part of the story that just it's not there in modern journalism. It's just not reported on. So
maybe we should all be Amish, right? And just turn the TV off altogether, right? Yeah. Then you don't have to, gamble online, and I don't have to be lied to by NPR.
I do not gamble online.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're going to go back, replay the tape from last week about how frustrated I am at all the prop betting that has ruined the Cleveland Guardians season. And you know that is abjectly false, sir. Well, speaking of cultural issues, things that are pervading the culture, great conversation coming up today with John Stonestreet of the Colson Center. New documentary is coming out next month called Truth Rising. And this is a necessary conversation. It's an overdue conversation for the church. David, we've been having this conversation with the work that we do for a while, but I think seeing what the Colson Center has put together to really encourage Christians and churches specifically to think about how we need to react and interact with the moment that we're in. This was really encouraging stuff.
Got to check this one out.
Well, it's going to be coming up here in just a second. Hope you'll stay tuned. John Stonestreet, our guest today on The Narrative. Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian chamber of commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org. Welcome back to The Narrative. Mike Andrews and David Mahan, joined now by John Stonestreet, who serves as the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Many of our listeners already know him. He's an author, ordained deacon, husband, a father of 4 children, and John and his wife Sarah and their family reside in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And John, we're so grateful for this opportunity to connect with you again. I think it's been a while since we've had a chance to have you on The Narrative, and we had you in Columbus about a year and a half or so ago for a conference, and great for this opportunity to catch up.
Yeah, no, I am too. I appreciate so much CCV's work. You guys do such terrific work there in Ohio, and appreciate the partnership as always.
Well, we want to talk to you about this new documentary that the Colson Center has coming out with focus on the family called Truth Rising. You and Os Guinness, you're interviewing cultural experts about this civilizational moment that the West is experiencing. So, I mean, it's kind of obvious based on the number of speakers that you have that overlap with our work. When you look at Chloe Cole, Katie Faust, Seth Dillon, a number of people that we've highlighted on the podcast, but just kind of give us the overview of the documentary and what you're hoping to communicate through it.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing here is something that I've learned from Os Guinness. I've learned a lot from Oz, as all of us have. He's, kind of a Gandalf of the Christian movement. But Oz has talked a lot about, the moment in history that we are in his cool British accent, he calls it the hour, and what he means by that is that God calls us to particular times and particular places. And even more than that, redemptive history is chronologically specific. In other words, the Bible talks a lot about God being engaged and involved in particular moments in history. And it's not an accident that we're in this one and not in another one. So what does that mean from all of us? George Orwell's famous for saying that in an age of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. There's a Christian version of that in a cultural moment like ours, where so many things are being kind of driven by myths and lies and deceit. Christians are called to be truth tellers. Not just these kind of people who become famous for being truth tellers, like a Katie or a Seth Dillon or a Jack Phillips. In fact, many of them, as we talk about in the documentary, didn't set out to be truth tellers, but they have ended up being truth tellers that God has used in remarkable ways, and that actually corresponds perfectly in God's providence to a moment in history that Oz calls a civilizational moment. We're at a tipping point. Listen, people have been talking about this a long time. Francis Schaeffer, talked about how the West was built on Christian ideals, and these other ideals, particularly about the human person, could derail the whole thing. Chuck Colson talked about, the consequences of ideas, especially when it comes to freedom and when it comes to morality, and it comes to human value and dignity. We've been wrestling with for a while, because of these thinkers, that ideas have consequences and ideas have civilizational level consequences. Well, here we are. We're at a really vulnerable point in history. I mean, we all have come through a time where in the last 5 years, we feel like we have whiplash between not knowing what a boy is or a girl is, to knowing and not knowing and knowing and trying to implement this in public policy. And that's just one area. I mean, we could go across so many other areas, as well. So here's what we're trying to put together. We are at a critical moment in history. The predictions of the civilizational level consequences of ideas have all come true. We all sense it. We all feel it. So what is God calling us to do? What does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean for you and me, not just these famous people, to emerge as truth tellers in whatever spheres of influence that God has placed us? That's what Truth Rising really is all about. And it's really a call to Christians to embrace this as part of what God wants them to be and wants them to do in this moment.
Did you notice, as you talked to Chloe and Seth and Katie about their respective journeys, I don't even want to say into the spotlight, but just to go against the cultural grain, because they all have such unique stories? Like, was there one specific thing that just kind of got them to the point where they said, I'm going to speak out about this? And then just the impact of that they have seen. And it can be just one person maybe that has a particularly strong example that you could share, but they've really changed the tide of the cultural conversation in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, and they're unlikely. I mean, Chloe's very unlikely. She was one of the ones deeply deceived by one of the great lies of our generation, which is that, gender and sexuality are social constructs, and there's really no such things as males and females. Now, listen, that's one thing when it's an idea being floated around by academics, in the ivory tower. It's another thing when it impacts little girls. And she's an example of, when I talk about civilization going off the rails, Oliver O'Donovan, the Anglican ethicist, wrote 25 years ago about what he then called transsexualism. And at the time, he rightly highlighted that the vast majority of those who struggle with this condition or this confusion are men, middle-aged, dealing with a sexual fetish. What we have seen in the last 10 years as this terrible idea has had its consequences and victims is that 5-1, according to the whistleblowers at Tavistock and the whistleblowers at St. Louis, the Washington University Hospital in St. Louis, are not middle-aged men. They're adolescent and pre-adolescent girls. This isn't about a sexual fetish. This is about self-hatred. And Chloe herself is an example of being deceived by that idea. Her parents being threatened with the suicide myth. Do you want a dead daughter or an alive son? And then in the middle of it, she came to realize it was all a lie. Her own personal embrace of the truth has now made her a champion of the truth. That's what's so beautiful about her story, because this is a distinctly Christian possibility that we can be redeemed, that we can be restored, and that when we are restored to truth, we can then become an agent of restoration. And that's her story. Jack Phillips is completely different. Jack, he's the nicest guy you've ever met on the planet. And you can be the nicest guy on the planet like Jack, but if you stand for truth, you can still be called a hater and a bigot and, all kinds of different things. And he had to deal with an enormous amount of public criticism, hatred, death threats, while being nice. And so, that's his part of the story. Katie's is different, in and of itself. She was kind of dragged out of the closet, pun intended, into this world. And she, has become this champion of children's rights, joining Christians throughout history who have championed children's rights. So, listen, I think all their stories have unique facets. All their stories give us a different angle on this. Seth Dillon's, the Babylon Bee one is absolutely fascinating, and because he took a stand. He could have backed down like a lot of people did to protect his platform, and justified it by going, otherwise we can't exist. And God used that in a political way and in a cultural way that was never expected, right? I mean, you think about how many things have emerged, culturally speaking, because Elon Musk bought Twitter. And why did Elon Musk buy Twitter? It's because the Babylon Bee got banned. I mean, this is a weird string of events, which has to do with, tell the truth and leave the results to God. So I guess each of the stories of these courageous truth tellers kind of focus on something different.
Yeah, I was, John, I was with you in Florida at the Alliance Defending Freedom conference not too long ago. And there was this talk of vibe shift that kind of kept coming up over and over again. I think even in your panel discussion, I'm intrigued by what you all are calling the civilizational moment, and like this pendulum shift that I think everybody is kind of sensing who's at the foundation of that, right? Because I think of Elon Musk. I don't know if anybody would consider him a Christian, but yet he's a big part of this shift that's taking place. Chloe Cole, had her breast removed at 15, 12 years old. She was telling folks, I think I'm a boy, and folks were affirming that. She came to know Christ after, actually the first place she ever testified was here in the state of Ohio. And when she was first here, she would not have considered herself a believer. Mm-hmm. By the time we had to overturn the governor's veto, she was a believer. And she was in the same state house with us. So my point is, we all acknowledge that this shift is happening. But can we say that it was caused by our churches, right? Or the churches, the amplifiers And the receptors of these individuals, like Elon Musk, hopefully, like Chloe Cole, who have basically come to themselves and seen the insanity of the reality going on in our culture, and now are at the point of decision. And then that's where the body of Christ comes in. But I think sometimes, like, the body of Christ is like standing there saying, hey, you know, first of all, we were late to the party, but now we're going to try to own it. And that's not necessarily.
No, that's exactly right. Because hear me really carefully. Like, the vibe shift that people are talking about is not the civilizational moment. The civilizational moment is a point that civilizations reach. Oz uses the phrase cut flower civilizations. In other words, a civilization that's cut off from its source, the source that brought it vitality and flourishing. When you cut that off, the flower still has shine on the petals, and then slowly the petals start to fall off, and finally there's a process of decay, and then there's death. The civilizational moment is when that clipping has happened and when that shine starts to go off the petal. It's not clear that the vibe shift is a time of renewal or revival.
Right.
I think that we are hearing that, and I think that's far premature. And I think that's exactly why we did this project the way that we did it. The project actually doesn't begin with these stories. The project begins by talking about civilizational history and what we can learn from civilizational history and what that means for us. So we interview some of these thinkers, many of whom are not Christians, or haven't. Some of them have more recently come to faith, but these are people who have an understanding of the critical nature of this moment for our civilization. And when a civilization is cut off from its roots, you either have to reattach it, it will find some other source of vitality, and that might not be a good thing.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Or it declines, and of course that's when do we ever talk about civilizations as human beings? It's when we're in a museum or when we're reading a history book, right? We think of civilizations as things of the past. We don't always think about our current civilization in those same terms. That's what we're trying to do, is say we are at this critical point. Now, the vibe shift, to your point, I think is real. In other words, 3 years ago, I mean, we're all in this room, in this virtual room, old enough to remember when it seemed like the trans train was going to run over everybody.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
When every corporation was on the DEI agenda and being very, very pushy about it, where the kind of thing that Jack Phillips did came with an enormous amount of risk personally and professionally. And so on. People have kind of pushed back against that. Pushing back against things that are obviously lies, untruthful, and harmful is not the same thing as reattaching to what's true.
That's right.
And we're not there yet. And that's exactly why we're calling the church right now to step into this moment. I'm not trying to pat anybody on the back to say we can take any credit for this, right? I mean, like, God has his people in a unique place right now. And I think the church cannot take credit, very much credit. It can take some, but not very much credit for even the vibe shift, for even the pushback against. There were a lot of Christians that showed up. There were a lot of Christians that did not.
Right.
But now what do we do? Because we are, biblically speaking, called not just to particular jobs. We're called to a moment. We're called to this time and this place. Paul says this to the Epicureans and Stoic on Mars Hill, that God determines the exact times that people live in the boundaries of their dwelling place. So here we are. He wanted us here. What kind of people? I mean, it's the question that Francis Schaeffer and Chuck Colson ask. How are we going to live? How now shall we live in this time, in this place? Yeah.
It's like within sin, right, comes its own innate judgment. And I feel like, folks are sensing that judgment, right? That what that sin has produced. But also the thing about sin is that when you are sin sick, you tend to want to seek out a physician. And this is the body's, this is our chance to guide folks who are struggling and whose light bulbs are going off, like Chloe Cole, to the great physician, right? So now is our moment, right? That I don't know, like I agree with you. We can't claim the tipping point. We can't claim the pendulum shift, back to sanity. But man, we can shine in this hour. I was meeting with some pastors not too long ago at a coffee shop. There's multiple denominations in the room. and they were down about what was going on culturally. And I got to talk about ADF. I was like, returning a Roe v. Overturning a Roe v. Wade, the defunding of Planned Parenthood's Medicaid money, and they heard all of these things in the news, but they didn't know it was the body of Christ that had their hands on that. They didn't know it's the body of Christ that's amplifying all of these things that they are now hearing. And I'm very excited about that. But I'm very excited also about your documentary and how you lay out this moment to where it's very tangible and easy and encouraging, right? Almost inspiring for folks to say, okay, let's get involved, and here's how.
Yeah. Well, look, all the stories of courage, and this is unique in the documentary where it starts out kind of talking about civilizational level history and reality to here's an individual story of courage. And that's exactly the journey we want people to go on. You're in a unique moment in history. How now are you going to live? But it's an amazing thing to consider the impact of these very unlikely voices of courage. But one of the things that has been deep on our hearts as an organization for a long time, and really at the source of the partnership with Focus on the Family, is that it's not just the professional's job to do this work, right? In other words, every Christian is called to be a truth teller. That may take all kinds of forms. That may take rejecting the lie in your own life and repenting. That may take taking a stand at a school board meeting. That may take just being courageous enough with your neighbor to say, I just don't agree with that. And have you ever considered this? Just that little, I mean, Chuck used to say this. In fact, he wrote this in How Now Shall We Live, that culture changes over the backyard fence and around the barbecue grill. Right? In other words, it's not just the professionals to go to DC and Hollywood. Look, a lot of the vibe shift has been just putting the brakes on things that were happening in DC. But putting the brakes on a runaway train heading off a cliff is not the same as turning that train around and taking us in a better direction. Sure. So how are we going to do that? And who else can lead towards truth? Walking away from the lie, that's a good first step. How do we reorient to the truth? That's what this is all about.
Yeah, there's some really strong metaphors there, John, about, just pushing back against the lie isn't the same thing as reconnecting to the truth or actually turning that train around. I'm kind of left with the question of, if the first step is for us to just stand for truth in our own spheres of influence, then what follows after that to really get this thing turned around on a cultural or civilizational level?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that is the first step, and I think it's a bigger step than you think. I mean, not than you think, but I mean that Christians often think is just that willingness to say things. I've just been so captivated, for example, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident who penned right before he was exiled from Russia that essay, "Live Not by Lies." And one of the things he says is, if the lie goes forward, just don't let it go through you. Just be the one that refuses to participate. Be the one that refuses. And there's so many different ways to do this. We know, for example, that a lot of the worst ideas that have been particularly harmful for kids have really been gone through the venue or the lane of just language. Don't use language that isn't true. Don't be co-opted in that. That's something that all of us, really can do. Don't participate. And once we do that, then I think that's a great first step. It's a big first step. And then, I think we're going to have to also, deeply consider what it looks like for Christians to offer hopeful and better alternatives. I know you guys have been deeply involved in this in the state of Ohio in terms of education. We're at a really critical moment in education in America where the kind of status quo state-run system is very, very vulnerable. And there's a lot of people squealing because they're losing tax dollars and they're losing protections. And a lot of parents are making different choices. And a lot of states are now enabling parents to make different choices. That's great. I spoke to a group of Christian school leaders recently, and I said, your schools are full and overflowing. And they all acknowledge that. I said, but that's not the win. The win is not that your schools are full and overflowing. The win is going to be what happens when those students come to your school. Right? And the reason they're full and overflowing isn't really because of our marketing genius right now. It's really because of the Loudoun County School Board pushing
That's
kids into Christian schools. So what they get when they get to that Christian school has to be remarkably different. It has to be better. It has to be true. It has to offer students the kind of vision for long-term success and meaning and purpose in life and relational depth and connectivity and a sense of calling and mission and preparation that currently the alternative is not providing. Right. So in other words, it's no good if they reject that one and they don't get anything better from us. What can we do that's better?
Yeah, and I haven't seen the entire documentary, but you all do, have this framework of civilization. And like you said, when do we really talk about civilizations outside of, history books and some museum? But every major civilization has a birthday and a death date, right? And are there, in terms of our U.S. context, are there symptoms to the death of a civilization? Where are we in terms of those symptoms? And like, are there stages? Like, are we fourth stage? Are we third stage? Where are we, man? Give me some.
DEFCON 4.
Oh, are there symptoms? Yeah. I mean, listen. The greatest existential threat to the planet right now is one of those symptoms, and it itself is a symptom of a larger set of ideas that could rightly be called anti-natalist, and that is basically a world that doesn't value children, that doesn't think about, and it's not just a world that doesn't value children; it's also a world that doesn't think about the future, and the symptom to your question is the demographic crisis. Look, it's not magic, as one of my friends says. This is math. If you're going to have a future as a civilization, you got to have babies. I don't know if you knew this. This is terrible news. The mortality rate is 100%. Everybody dies. So you got to replace those people. And no civilization can really survive for long if their fertility rate drops below a particular level. Now, that number it runs in the ballpark of 2.1 to 2.4. And once it drops below something like 1.7, and this is, by the way, the average number of children per woman. That's what we're talking about here, right?
This is where 1.7 is where we are in Ohio right now.
We're 1.6 in America, so you guys are above the national curve, And I always joke, how much of that is due to homeschooling, But there's this is a very, very important factor, because once you drop below 1.7, then you don't have enough babies to marry enough babies in the future, right? In other words, it becomes a complicating crisis. Well, listen, just on an economic level, that becomes a disaster where you don't have enough workers to support people that are in a bigger aging, population. So then you have things like government-run healthcare, and then that leads to incentives for things like doctor-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, we just went down a huge rabbit trail, right? We started with not having enough babies, and we ended with killing old people. You know why? That's exactly what Francis Schaeffer predicted. Right. I mean, he talked about that the value that was communicated culturally through abortion would lead to euthanasia and doctor-assisted death. What he predicted, has come true. That's a civilizational vulnerability. But think about it. It's not just we're not having enough babies. We don't value babies. We treat babies as accessories to an adult lifestyle of comfort. A buddy of mine told me the other day, he walked up to the airport gate and he's like, there was a kid on a leash and a dog in a stroller. And I'm like, we're doomed. Wow. I mean, that's everything, right? And that's just a picture of all the different ways we have lost a distinctive of human dignity, human value, and that human beings are actually good things, not problems. And you think about Marxism, you think about totalitarianism, you think about all the different isms that created so much havoc in the 20th century. They all saw human beings as a problem that needed to be highly controlled by the state. What could possibly go wrong with this plan? Well, we saw it. And so you have a return to those same things. So, I mean, listen, that was a big, long rabbit trail for you. I'm not sure, but that's what I mean when I say, yes, there are tons of indications that we're at this critical moment in a civilization, and it just becomes sustainable, not in any kind of esoteric ideological way, but just in how many babies we're having. And that's just one example.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been a long, slow descent as you unpack a lot of the um, thoughts in the 20th century that have led us to this moment. And so now that the tendrils are so deep within our culture, this obviously isn't going to be a quick fix. So since the church was really napping on the front end of this that allowed the decline to get to this point, what does the church need to do to get us on the upswing and, not just make this moment, as David said, a vibe shift, but to actually take this moment and start something that's really going to begin unwrapping all of these bad ideas that are infiltrating everything?
Well, look, I think one of the things is in a secular world, it becomes very tempting for Christians to become secularists with a twist. In other words, we believe in God, we believe in heaven and hell, we believe in salvation, but often think about them in very personal, private ways. Christianity is personal. It's a worldview built on an understanding of a God who himself is a person who makes himself personally known. He's not the force of, Star Wars, and he's not aloof like, the God of Islam. He is a all-powerful, personal being who has revealed himself. That's one of the great features and one of the great blessings of the Christian worldview of who God's revealed himself to be. But personal doesn't mean private. And the highly privatized faith of Christians, where we think about, this is between me and God, but we don't actually then see the public implications of Christian truth. C.S. Lewis, for example, was asked what the most important philosophical statement of all time is. He said, in the beginning, God, because so many other things flow from that. I mean, think about it. If that statement is true, the entire universe is a different place than if that statement is not true. And the public implications, we often talk about, go by that kind of the term worldview, basically realizing that Christianity is personal, but it's not private. And the task, I think, of churches right now that we're kind of downstream from some of these things that you mentioned, is to recatechize Christians in the fullness of the gospel, to recatechize Christians in what it means that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, that he is Lord of heaven and earth, and that he is making all things new, and he has called us to be a part of his redemptive history at this moment, in this time, in this place. I mean, that's kind of big, heady stuff, but it's not something that's reserved for just the theologians or the pastors or the missionaries or the really courageous bakers in Denver. It's something that is for all of us to say, God has redeemed me in Christ. What has he now called me to do? So it's a crisis of catechism, I think. One of the things that we worked really hard on as well as a follow-up to the documentary Truth Rising is a study. And this is a 4-part series that churches, small groups, pastors, parents, families can use to walk through the public implications of Christian truth, to kind of get back to how big of a worldview is Christianity anyway, and to ground Christians in hope, truth, identity, and calling. And those 4 kind of pillars of what we would call a Christian worldview, I think, are the core things that need to be recatechized within the church. So I would really hope Christians, I know it sometimes feel like we're preaching to the choir, but I remember being at a meeting with Chuck Colson years ago, and somebody piped up, man, we just need to get all the Christians saved and we'll be in good shape. And I think that guy had a point, I do think we have a crisis of catechism, and that crisis of catechism has to be addressed before we get to this, before our activism becomes unhinged.
So with this study, John, is it for like families? If I wanted to take my kids through this as well as part of their kind of catechism into a different culture, is that something that I could do with them?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And particularly, high schoolers and beyond. This is something that families can do together and churches can do together. Obviously the Colson Center, one of the big things that we do is what's called the Colson Fellows Program. This is a deep dive into Christian worldview that exists in churches and communities across America. We're going to see our Colson Fellows lead studies and home groups and things like that on the Truth Rising study. And really what the documentary is designed to do is to clarify add an incredible amount of clarity to the moment we're in. Like, this is a civilizational moment, and not all Christians are called to that kind of a moment, but we are. And so how should we live? What's it mean to be a truth teller at such a time and place as this? And then the study's really designed to come, behind that and say, this is what it's going to look like. It's real simple. It's real accessible and attainable. Short videos led by discussion. That's the way the study is designed. So I think it's something that'll be usable in a lot of different contexts.
Well, can you give? I mean, I'm excited to see all of these resources.
Coloring book for David.
Yeah, that's right.
David needs a coloring book in order to be able to get the most out of it.
While I'm sitting in a tree stand, I could just sit and color about worldview. Is there a pay? Will all these resources be behind a paywall? Will they need to subscribe? How do they find these resources?
Yeah, the global streaming premiere of the Truth Rising film is September the 5th, Friday, September the 5th. You can go to truthrising.com. and sign up there, and you can host a watch party. You can, stream it. You can, plan to host it with friends. It's going to be available there, and then the study will follow that to those after watching the documentary. Find out how to access the study. But we're committed that this isn't going to cost anybody anything. This is something that's been an investment, a big investment of time and money from Focus on the Family and also from the Colson Center. And we just think it's time. Like, it's, listen, if the time and place that we're in is a critical aspect of every Christian calling, the time and place that we're in is a critical aspect of the calling of our organizations, Focus on the Family and the Colson Center. And so we're trying to serve that calling as best we can through this project.
That's just awesome, John. Once again, that website, truthrising.com, for anybody out there who's interested in watching the film, checking out the study, truthrising.com. I'm excited to check it out. John, we're so grateful for all the work that you're doing with the Colson Center and for taking this time today to walk us through the documentary and the study. And we'll be praying for the success of this endeavor. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.